Giroux and Monsieur Blakey. We are moving to the Conservatives, and Mr. Poilievre, you've got the floor for 5 minutes. I think you're on mute, Mr. Poilievre.
Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Giroux, thank you for coming. You've recently published a report in which you chronicled $542 billion of government spending measures, almost a third of which is not part of the COVID-19 response plan. So how much in new additional measures has the government enacted in the last 2 years or since the COVID crisis began that is unrelated to COVID-19?
So my estimate is about $176 billion, give or take a billion or two. That is not directly related to COVID-19. Since
which start date?
Since the start of the pandemic.
Since the start of the pandemic, the government has enacted over $176 billion of new spending measures that have nothing to do with COVID. You have said that the government has government's own guardrails, which it has set in place, have now been reached, and that there is no longer justification for a new $100 billion of additional spending. The chief economist for Scotiabank came to our committee last week, and he said that all things being equal, additional deficit spending would contribute to inflation. Do you agree with him on that?
I agree with him if the additional spending is not to increase the productive capacity of the Canadian economy. So if it's purely to stimulate demand, it does indeed create inflationary pressures.
So deficits can contribute to inflation?
Yes, they can.
And could $100 billion of additional deficit spending measures potentially contribute to inflation?
Again, if they're not destined to increase the productive capacity of the economy, they can create inflationary pressures.
Because they create, in that case, more demand without meeting it with new supply.
Exactly. So they create more demand in an economy that's already running close to or at full capacity.
Right. And obviously that capacity is quite weak. But it is the fact that we have such a weak economy and we're considering it to be at full capacity is really quite a depressing story. More dollars chasing fewer goods always leads to higher prices. Some are even calling that just inflation. And I won't ask you to comment on that because I know that that's not necessarily in your report. But do you believe that we can continue to go on adding new debt at this rate, or do you think that that it is advisable for us to get on a prudent path to reducing the debt to GDP ratio?
Well, I've said a couple of times that we could afford a deficit that was as high as the one in the last fiscal year, but we could not afford that many years in a row. So as deficits decline, that suggests that the fiscal situation will return to more sustainable levels of deficit. But it's clear that we could not have afforded the same level of deficit that we saw in 2020-21 for many years in a row.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
Got 45 seconds.
45 seconds. All right. Mr. Parliamentary Budget Officer, we have had 85% housing inflation since the Prime Minister took office. When he came into office, the typical house went for $436,000. That typical price has risen to $811,000. Last year, we had all-time record housing inflation of 26%. Do you believe that the negative real interest rates on variable rate mortgages might be contributing to the demand that is ballooning these house prices?
Very short answer.
It is very clear that very low interest rates are fueling demand because most people don't buy a house paying in cash. They look at the monthly payment and they decide based on that what type of house they can afford. So lower interest rates mean lower, other things being equal, lower monthly payments, and lower rates mean that people can afford to spend more on a house. So yes, it is creating upward pressures on prices for housing.
Merci, Monsieur Poilievre. We are moving now to the Liberals and Ms. Zarowitz for 5 minutes.